it's mostly a civil rights agency. Right. So to protect the rights of students so that they can have access to public education across. It's not this big thing that the federal government right now is saying it was, oh, we got to give it back to the states. It was always the state's responsibility. I think that was just part of the whole shtick to try to make it seem like it's this behemoth. It's one of the smallest agencies.
Kind of speak to the role that the federal government plays in education, because there's a lot of different thoughts about what the federal government actually does. Let's back up and pretend the Department of Education still exists as it did when you were the secretary. Yeah.
Well, let me go back, right?
Sure.
So I want to share with you and the audience, like, I was a fourth grade teacher, right? So I did that. I was a school principal. I did that for 10 years. So I was able to see the role of education from different levels. I was a district leader for a little while. I was a commissioner of education in Connecticut for a little while. Then I went to, so my responses are based not only on my role as a secretary of education for President Biden for 4 years, but also my whole 27 years of being an educator. The federal role is really small. It's really small, and it's designed that way. And I want it to be that way because when I was a teacher, I didn't care what Washington, D.C. was telling me to do. I cared what my local board was telling me, what the students needed. So it's a very small role. Federal government provides 9% of funding only. Not a lot, but important funding.
Just to clarify also, that used to be true. Do you know if that's still true post, I guess, abolishing of the Department of Education?
There's limits in funding that were moved in the last year. So,
gotcha.
But overall, it's a very small pocket of funding, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's mostly a civil rights agency. Right. So to protect the rights of students so that they can have access to public education across. It's an agency whose job is to administer the funding that Congress approves. Right. So I'm showing that it's not this big thing that the federal government right now is saying it was, oh, we got to give it back to the states. It was always the state's responsibility. I was a commissioner of education. And I could tell you that when I was commissioner, the federal government didn't tell me what to do, how to do things. That was never the case. And when I was secretary, despite having experience in different pockets of education, I knew it wasn't my job to tell them how to run, curriculum in classrooms in Florida, whatever. Mm-hmm. So I think that was just part of the whole shtick to try to make it seem like it's this behemoth. It's one of the smallest agencies at the federal level. So
just to hammer this point home, because I remember it was probably 10 years ago, there was the Common Core scare.
Right.
My understanding, and you correct me if I'm wrong, is the federal government has basically zero input when it comes to curriculum for the states.
Right.
That it doesn't dictate this is how you teach, here's your curriculum for the day. Right. There's a lot of people, and by that I mean like half the country seem to believe that the federal government was telling states exact. And I'm saying this because one of the things that was so often repeated a few months ago was, we're giving education back to the states. We're giving education back to the states to run it. But it was always that way, is my understanding.
It was. Mm-hmm. And I'll get to the Common Core, but the funny thing is, I don't think it's funny, but
so many things that
there is more federal requirements now. There's more policing of what you're doing, or you're going to pull your money back, not only in K-12, but higher ed, right? So if anything, while we're saying we're giving it back to the states, we're mandating what you can and cannot do in the classrooms, or else we're going to pull your money. But going back to the Common Core, there was an effort there to standardize what kids knew across the country so that when we're comparing Alabama to Kentucky to Nebraska to Connecticut, we have a similar standard of what success looks like. And you saw the backlash there, right? And the intent there was to say, if we say a B in Arkansas is similar to a B in Oregon, there's some relative comparison. You could say, well, what's working, what's not working, right? Because as a former district leader and commissioner of education, I knew that a passing score in Connecticut might be something totally different in another state. You follow what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That was the intent, in my opinion, there.
Are there any standard requirements right now for tests, like federally, that students should be able to pass, or is all of that still left, like given the testing requirements for the states? It
has gotten to the point where you can make some comparisons. It's still not a perfect system. I think that's where like the SATs or the other tests like that come into play, because if a score in an SAT doesn't matter what state you're in, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's kind of what does that. And that's why I think there's a heavy reliance on those type of things when it comes to admission, because we don't have, a score on a state test in one state means nothing in another.
Yeah. When you talk about scoring things and you talk about grades, I hear from every level, from teachers to parents to students, there's like this binary of teaching the subject versus teaching to the test.
Right.
Do you have an opinion on?
I have an opinion on everything in education.
Sure. Okay,
It's a loaded question. And again, most of my opinion comes from my experience in the classroom, being a school principal. I'm a big believer that we must assess where students are, or else we're playing games. Because I've seen cases where students have gotten A's on their report card and they're thrilled, and then when it comes to an assessment that measures their ability to understand state standards, they're below basic. I've seen that, and unfortunately, it happens to disproportionately to students in underperforming communities, right? So I'm a big believer in high standards and making sure that our assessments are aligned with standards. But I've also seen the opposite, where we've become overly enamored with standardized tests to the point where we remove topics that are not going to be covered, or we reduce pedagogy and teaching to the way the students are going to see it on the test, which in my opinion disengages students. And then we wonder why kids don't want to go to school or they're not doing well. Yeah.
What do you think when it comes to like one of the big issues we have today is it seems like the scoring for American students for basic things.
Yeah.
I feel like I read an article a couple weeks ago related to like even being able to read at a competent level, like a high school level, that more and more of the population is sliding into not being able to do this.
Yeah.
What do you think, where are the big failures today coming in from for education?
Well, it's multifaceted, right? But I do feel that we are not where we should be internationally on the international tests. I think, a close look at our assessment data over the years, for decades, it's not something that there should be a sense of urgency around addressing it. And then you add the pandemic that really disproportionately affected students who didn't have access, and it made gaps worse. We really need to have a sense of urgency around it. I think a lot of it has to do with, number one, and you're going to hear a common theme in this conversation. We pay teachers 24% less than people with similar degrees in other professions. When I walked in as secretary, there was shortages of educators across the country. People just not interested in the profession, not to mention that they're being blamed. So I've had conversations with the Minister of Education of Finland. I've had conversations with the Minister of Education in Singapore, right? So these are the countries that we're aspiring to. There's no magic. They treat the profession like a profession. They're selective with who's in front of the classroom. They're compensated to the point where they don't have to bartend or drive Uber on the weekends. They're given professional learning opportunities, and schools are treated as the foundation for their country's growth. So to me, it's really investing in making sure that we're respecting the profession, that our schools have the tools that they need. And we've seen examples of that. New York Times reported while I was secretary that the gap between black students and non-black students in fourth grade closed more in 1 year, I think it was 22 to 23, than at any other point before 2009. There was an investment in addressing the disparities. So I do worry that we're just taking an approach like we want Finland results, but we don't put in Finland investments. I do think that's a bigger argument. So schools are the byproduct of us not valuing education in this country the way we should. And I think we're seeing that now with the dismantling of it, with the attacks on higher education, with vouchers where some students have access to education, other students are left with whatever's left over in the public schools. So I think we're going in the wrong direction in terms of that. But until we as a country can really recognize that if we don't have a strong foundation, you're not going to build skyscrapers. And what does that look like? I do think accountability is a part of it too. I'm not trying to say that funding is the only thing. We need to make sure that we're holding folks accountable for results. And, I do think accountability is a big part of it, but I also think support has to be a part of it. And we like the accountability part, but in many places there's not enough support for our students.